I'll go. I'll find it.
Make sure you step over the wires.
Yes, for sure.
Hi. Just please be careful. There you go.
Well, Papa.
When it gets quiet, it must be time for the show to start. I think we will start. I'm Canon John DeNero. I'm the rector or the pastor of this magnificent church, and I serve here with some wonderful people who are members of this community. And I want to say a few things. I'll try to be very brief. The first thing I want to say is maybe we should all turn off our cell phones, or at least silence them. and I'll take it from there. We here at St. Anne and the Holy Trinity, we say that we exist or kind of stand at the intersection of faith and culture on the corner of Clinton and Montague Streets in Brooklyn Heights. And we're very proud, very grateful to have been partners with the Brooklyn Book Festival for at least a decade now, except for maybe 1 year in COVID. This, if you don't know, is an official Brooklyn Book Festival bookend event. And while I'm talking about that, I'm going to mention that although I think most of you are members of Joe's fan club and may not be from around here or may not be planning to come to any other events, we are hosting an event on Friday called Spirit and Flesh, Our Bodies, Our Blackness, Ourselves, featuring an amazing young writer whose name is Cole Arthur Riley. She's writing in the genre or area of Black spirituality. She'll be in conversation with a woman who's written many books, Tracy Michelle Lewis Jiggets. And that'll be at 7 on Friday. So I'll also mention, again, though some of you are probably only coming to this event, that if you're in Brooklyn or nearby, this is how you can find out about other Brooklyn Book Festival events, bookend events, and also the big events on Sunday, some of which we'll be hosting here. There are many of these copies of this on the ushers table in the entrance of the church, and also there's a lot of stuff to see online. I will say that there are a few more people here than we have in church on Sunday, and I don't know how I feel about that, but that's great. And I want to just start by telling you about the two people who you're going to be hearing from shortly. You probably know that Joe Sexton has been a reporter and senior editor at the Times, New York Times, and ProPublica. He directed or assisted in 6 projects awarded Pulitzer Prizes, including An Unbelievable Story of Rape, which inspired the Netflix series Unbelievable, a story for The New Yorker magazine that Joe wrote and edited won a George Polk Award and an Overseas Press Club Award for international reporting on human rights in 2022. And this book that we're here to hear about and hear from him tonight about is The Lost Sons of Omaha, 2 Young Men in an American Tragedy. And it was published by Scribner just a few months ago in May. He is at work, according to his bio that he wrote, so who knows if it's true, on a crime documentary film with HBO. He will be talking to Dion Graham, who's a very well-known stage and film actor who has starred on Broadway and in the iconic television series The Wire. Dion was named Audiophiles Magazine's Golden Voice Narrator, and he holds a place in Audible's Narrator Hall of Fame. And he narrated this book. To continue, I want to welcome you, Dion, and say how honored I am that you agreed to take part in this event. And I look forward to getting to know you through your conversation with Joe tonight. I also want to say God bless you for being Joe's friend. And I'm only half kidding. We both know you got to love this guy, but it takes some work. You got to get to know him. Joe, when I met you 5 or 6 years ago, maybe longer, I don't know, when you were hanging around here a bit, I knew you were a journalist, and I then discovered that you'd covered this church when it was a bit more newsworthy for some challenging reasons, and that's when you were on one of your several beats at the New York Times. But to me, you were otherwise a gruff, kind of cocky, unapologetically straight white male. And it was your association with your then partner, now wife Beth, and your darling youngest children. That gave me some reason to think you weren't all bad. Oh, and also that you share DNA with your amazing sister Lucy, who I met years before you and who is literally cooler than cool. I'm being intentionally provocative, of course. Your incredible book, The Lost Sons of Omaha, Two Young Men in an American Tragedy, that we are all looking forward to hearing you and Dion talk about, reinforces the problem of pigeonholing people and reducing them to caricatures, of deciding you know who someone is based on stereotypes, prejudgments, and misinformation, and the potential for conflict that can come from an unwillingness to know more about someone once you've sized them up. Joe, your book makes me glad I never really embraced social media, I have to say. But of course, it's not just through social media that people are persuaded to take sides and dig in their heels. As Americans, we seem to be at war with ourselves on so many different battlefields. For your first book that you wrote decades into your storied career as a reporter, you took on the fateful encounter of James Scurlock and Jake Gardner, citizens of Omaha, whose lives collided in the explosive first days of protests following the murder of George Floyd in May of 2020. There were layers and layers to unpack in this assignment, which you managed with great competence and great grace. Your journalistic skills are beyond extraordinary to me, I have to say. You're a great tactician or technician, but you approach your subjects with such heart. If you didn't have such a big heart for the people you write about, you probably couldn't have written this book, or not nearly as good a one. So many people let you into their lives and shared a great deal with you because you are a journalist who they knew they could trust. Of course, you had your share of doors closed on you, sometimes from the start, sometimes eventually, but only ever by people who were uncomfortable with the truth, it seemed. I'll just say finally that I sometimes wondered how many laptops it took to write this book, because I just imagine you literally sobbing and slobbering over your computer through tragedy upon tragedy that you were reporting. But the book is a gift, and I want to congratulate you on your great achievement. And I want to welcome you here to the podium. And please welcome Joe Sexton.
Can you hear me okay? Anyway, first, just thanks to all of you for coming and for holding up under the relentless browbeating and spiritual extortion that I used to get you here. I thought I would thank a couple people first. John, of course, the Brooklyn Book Festival. There are a couple people here who I have to directly thank for the book. John Jordan and Lila Hassan are both here, who helped me with research and fact-checking the book. Dion, who we had never met until I was sent an email in which I could select who I wanted to narrate the book. And it took me about 2 seconds or whatever. But then it turns out he knows my brother Michael, and the world is a small place. But he's been a real partner in grace and compassion. I went to see him in a spectacularly moving play off Broadway, and maybe we can talk about that a little bit later. Then I thought I would just give you a little run of show. Is that the right term, Lucy, Big Lucy? I'm going to talk a little bit here, and then I'm going to do, I guess it's a reading, but I tried to, sort of condense and distill the book into something that I could deliver in 10 minutes or so. So I'm going to give that a shot, just because I can't presume, anybody or everybody here has had a chance to read the book or ever will. So I think it could give us a grounding for our conversation and any kinds of additional questions and conversation you guys would like to have. This is a very special place. And while God's presence is, kind of cool aspect of it, it's not the best thing about this place. The best thing about this place is, and John will confirm this, I'm literally standing, I think, exactly on the spot where Beth and I were married 3 years ago. Now, by March of 2020, Beth and I had been together 21 years, and we had been officially engaged for 11. Beth is both a romantic and a pragmatist, and so at the start of what became a global pandemic, in her, capacity for emergency planning, decided we could both die, Joe, and so, all the details of our estate and whatever would be clear if we got married. Love in the time of coronavirus. But that's a different book. So let's talk a little bit about this book. I had never really, truly, ever much wanted to write a book. It scared the bejesus out of me. I never thought I had the discipline or the talent to do it. I have had opportunities, and agents had pitched me on trying to write a book, and publishers had offered me the chance to do so, but it felt too intimidating. So how did I actually come to write this one, which it appears I have? So 2 quick things that can account for that. So a couple months after Beth and my marriage here, we were back in Brooklyn to pack up and move our stuff up to Vermont, where we had quickly fled on our honeymoon. And we were packing up our house in Brooklyn, and I got a call from the editor-in-chief of ProPublica, where I was then a senior editor and had sort of gone back into doing some reporting and writing. And it was a Thursday in July, and Steve Engelberg, who's the editor-in-chief, said, we don't have anything to publish for Tuesday, and it looks like there was a racial killing in Omaha, and maybe a white supremacist got away with murder. Do you think you could turn that around by Tuesday? Now, I say that with not only great affection for Steve, but complete familiarity. It is one of the few, I think, actual eternal truths of journalism or newspapering, is that it doesn't matter what news organization you're working at, whether you're at the New York Times with 1,700 employees, or you're at the City Sun in Brooklyn with 4, or you're at the United Press International or the Syracuse Post-Standard. All news organizations, day in and day out, are driven by a basic desperation for stories and copy, and what do we have for tomorrow's paper? And it often feels like there's never enough, or you're always completely afraid that there might not be. So I recognized in Steve the need to maybe try and turn around a racial murder story in a couple of days. We're here 3 years later after that. That Tuesday came and went. Something else got to fill the publishing hole. And when I left ProPublica, Steve was gracious enough to let me take this story because while I had inquired into it initially when he called me up and realized it was a far more complicated story than something that could be turned around in a couple of days, I had sort of followed developments in it and had kind of written a rough version of a magazine-length piece about the story. And Steve allowed me to take that with me when I left. And I found myself at 61, no longer attached to a major news organization, and curious about how I was actually going to make a living and conduct myself. I thought, well, at 61, maybe I should get a fucking agent. That would be a start, perhaps. And so Todd Schuster, who's here tonight, became that agent. And I shared with him a draft of the magazine story, and he said, oh, Joe, there's more than this. You should do it as a book. And I was filled with my usual mortification, but I was like, well, you know, I'm in my new next chapter, and I trusted Todd to know what he was talking about, or what he could be a judge of. And I said, well, sure. So we turned it into a book proposal, and we sent it out to publishers a couple days before I was to go on a reporting trip to North Africa. Libya in particular, and Todd was like, do you want to send it out before Libya or when you get back? And I said, oh, no, send it out now. Along with Ian Urbina, who's a great, extraordinary reporter, a former Times colleague, and now the founder and editor-in-chief of the Outlaw Ocean Project, he had invited me to go on a reporting trip with him and two other people to write about the quite extraordinary tragedy of migrants, or actually of the European Union's efforts to halt migrants from making it from Africa to Europe to the promise of a future and safety. And many of them were being detained in Libya in some ghastly circumstances. So we went to report on that, and I got an email when we were in Tripoli from Todd, and he said, well, there's a senior editor at Knopf would like to talk to you about the book proposal. Do you have internet or a Wi-Fi? And I was like, yeah, sure, I'm in a hotel in Tripoli, it seems to be working, your fucking email came through. So we set a meeting for Monday at 10 o'clock. And on that Sunday night in Tripoli, the four of us were abducted and held for close to a week. And it was a rather unpleasant experience, but we made it home through the great efforts of our families and the United States State Department. And when I landed at JFK, I wanted to contact my family and other people, and I thought I should probably call Todd, because I didn't show up for that Zoom call on Monday. I hope the guy at Knopf is not really that pissed. It still kind of delights me to imagine the two of them on the Zoom being like, who the fuck is this Joe Sexton guy? I mean, he doesn't even give us a heads up. He doesn't show. He's never even written a book before. And Todd was concerned about my welfare, of course, but then he said, well, don't worry, there are 7 major American publishing houses who want to talk to you about your proposal. Do you think you could do it in a series of Zoom calls this week? And I was literally 48 hours out of a Libyan jail cell. And I said, why not? And so when the offer from Scribner came to do the book, I really do believe I was in some kind of altered state, because if I was my normal, kind of anxious, panicked, self-doubting self, I don't think I ever would have done the book or said yes. But I really was in some kind of strange fog, and I said yes. And here we are. So I'll do a little bit of a reading. I hope it doesn't go on too long. Dion has got me nervous about that. He's telling me people don't want to be bored. I said if they came to a book event, they want to be bored. By nightfall on May 30th, 2020, Jake Gardner was inside his nightclub in Omaha's Old Market District. He had 2 pistols and a shotgun. One of his regular bartenders eventually joined him. A second night of Black Lives Matter protests in the streets of Omaha had turned ugly, and the crowds were descending on the city's downtown. Bricks and Molotov cocktails were being heaved at buildings and at police, and officers in riot gear had responded with tear gas. Gardner was a white 38-year-old product of Omaha schools who had won a presidential medal as part of one of the very first U.S. Marine Corps units to invade Iraq in 2003. Gardner had returned to Omaha and made a success of himself running one of the city's most popular downtown bars. That bar had been shuttered for weeks amid the initial outbreak of the pandemic, and Gardner had been bleeding losses. With a reopening imminent, he had stocked his bar full of liquor, what one partner said represented some $90,000 in prospective gross income. The 2 nights of angry protests had been triggered by George Floyd's murder at the hands of a police officer in Minneapolis, and young people had filled Omaha's streets. James Skurlock, 22, was one of them. Named for his father, Skurlock was one of more than 24 siblings, including stepbrothers and stepsisters, who spent all or parts of their upbringing in North Omaha, the black and mostly poor corner of Omaha. Skurlock had endured bouts of homelessness as a child and was put behind bars at 16, denied the chance at any kind of diversion program that might have offered mental health treatment or educational help instead of jail time. He had issues then with America's criminal justice system. Skurlock and a friend that night had trashed a business office down the block from Gardner's bar and had later helped smash the windows to Gardner's establishment and heave garbage and debris inside. Gardner and his bartender had hid out behind a wall inside the bar. Gardner was prepared to use his guns if it came to that, but he wound up calling 911 for help. Gardner, I've got some people breaking in all the windows right now. It's 1207 Harney Street. Dispatcher, 1207 Harney, are you on scene there or are you viewing this from a camera? I'm inside the window being broken right now. Is that the Hive? Yeah, correct. How many people? More than 10? Yeah, for sure. There's like a whole mob of them. I have no idea. They're throwing things through windows. I just wanted to call in and make sure that I was on the record. Okay, anybody inside injured? Need a rescue squad? No, we're good. We're kind of pulled back away from the windows. I'm pretty sure they used a gun, so we pulled back pretty far so that nobody got injured, and then we parked behind a brick wall. Okay, it's pretty crazy. What's your name, please? My name is Jacob Gardner. I'm the owner of this place. Shortly before 11 p.m., there was a lull in the tumult, and Gardner, the bartender, and Gardner's father, who had just arrived, stood outside the bar. When the father saw a business next door being vandalized and knew, he pushed a white protester who was filming the scene and swore at him. Then, Skurlock's friend leveled the 69-year-old father. Jake Gardner, a pistol in his waistband, went to see who had flattened his dad. Skurlock raced across the street and, along with others, got in front of Gardner. Black Lives Matter, someone said. I agree, Gardner said. He told those in front of him that if they hadn't knocked his father to the ground, they should move on. Skurlock and others advanced on Gardner. Gardner, backing up toward the front of his bar, flashed the gun in his pants, then held it at his side, then put it back, all the while telling people to stay away from him. Suddenly, Gardner was jumped from behind by a young woman and taken to the ground. He fired 2 shots and tried to get to his feet. Skurlock then jumped on his back, and the 2 struggled for the gun. Gardner pleaded with Skurlock to get off him. He then got the gun in his left hand and fired a single bullet over his shoulder. Shot in the neck, Skurlock was pronounced dead shortly afterward. Across 40 years as a newspaperman, I'd always been drawn to heartbreak. The Catholic bishop who died of AIDS in secret and in shame. The Brooklyn girl on her roller skates killed by a stray bullet. I'd found that in diving into those stories of devastating loss, I almost always discovered people of remarkable grace, found moments of acceptance and forgiveness. What happened in Omaha was, of course, far more complicated than a child accidentally slain in the street. Scurlock's death occurred as the country had reached a breaking point. In 2020, whether it was the men who chased Ahmaud Arbery through their neighborhood before one of them shot him at close range, or a police officer slowly asphyxiating George Floyd in front of onlookers in Minneapolis, black men dying at the hands of white men was a raw and explosive issue in America. Yet the events in Omaha seem to me to amount to a certain kind of tragedy, and an important one in an angry and divided nation, not the straightforward tragedy of great loss resulting from bad luck, not the Shakespearean variety involving the noble person with a tragic flaw. Rather, the sort in which two characters, both with stakes in their community, maybe one black and the other white, take matters into their own hands and produce an awful outcome. A tragic result for which there are no outright villains, a horror in which the specifics of the individuals and their fateful circumstances aren't swept up by larger agendas or long-standing grievances, however real and true. Maybe Gardner shouldn't have been out there with a gun that night. Maybe he should have grabbed his father and gotten away from everyone as quickly as he could. But maybe he had, in several critical seconds, legitimately feared for his life. Maybe Scurlock should not have been vandalizing businesses, but maybe he, in the same critical seconds, legitimately wanted to prevent more gunfire and had jumped on the man with the weapon. Such tragedies, it seemed to me, could offer the families and communities that suffered grievous pain the chance to heal together. And I knew, or I thought I knew, that they had happened in America not that long ago. Here's one I have carried with me for more than a decade. Shortly after 10 p.m. on May 22, 2009, Omar Edwards, a black rookie officer with the NYPD, had just finished up his shift. Edwards, 25, was the father of two young boys, and as he left the 25th precinct in Harlem, he texted his wife that he was eager to get home. He'd be off for the next couple of days. Edwards, upon leaving the station house, was startled to see someone trying to break into his car in the street. A scuffle followed, and when the thief ran off, Edwards pulled his off-duty weapon and gave chase. Just then, Andrew Dunton, 30, was in the front passenger seat of an unmarked car along with two other members of the 25th Precinct's anti-crime unit, charged in part with getting guns off the city's streets. A raft of felony arrests had led to Dunton's promotion into the unit, but in his nearly 5 years on the job, he'd never had to fire his weapon. Dunton stumbled for a second as he rushed to get out of his vehicle while it was still moving, quick to try and confront a man with a gun in his hand racing through the street. Dunton, from behind the car's open door, managed to shout, "Police, drop the gun." Edwards, investigators would later determine, turned toward Dunton, made eye contact, pointed his gun, and according to one witness, started to say what sounded like a single word: police. Dunton fired 6 bullets. Emergency personnel discovered Edwards was an officer when they cut open his clothes to see that he was wearing a police academy t-shirt. His badge was found in his front pants pocket. It was a shattering story, and as the Metropolitan editor at the Times, I poured resources into covering it. What has stayed with me all these years is what happened next. New York, despite its vast and lacerating racial history, did not explode in protest. Robert Morgenthau, the legendary white Manhattan district attorney, convened a grand jury, and Dunton was among some 20 people who testified before it. The grand jury found no cause to prosecute Dunton. At the funeral for Edwards, hundreds of officers, black, white, Asian, Latino, male, female, lined the streets of Brooklyn. Inside Our Lady of Victory Roman Catholic Church, then Mayor Michael Bloomberg announced Edwards would be posthumously promoted to the rank of detective, improving the benefits his widow would receive. The church's pastor, when he rose to eulogize Edwards, included a call to pray for Dunton as well. He too needs compassion, the pastor said. Should Edwards, not even out of his probationary period as an officer, have taken off after a petty thief with his gun drawn? Likely not. Was Dunton's action subconsciously colored in some way by implicit bias? A black man with a gun couldn't be anything but a threat? Likely yes. But there were no villains. More training might help things. Hate wouldn't. With no fingers to point, it seemed, people had found a way to join hands. The grief was profound, and it was shared. Years before he became mayor of New York, Eric Adams, a former cop, captured the heartbreak. This is the most Shakespearean aspect of policing, he said. Your greatest fear is to be shot and slain on duty, and that's only matched by your fear of shooting another officer. If you speak with 9 out of 10 officers of color, they would tell you that when they hear sirens, in their head they are thinking, I hope these cops know that I'm one of the good guys. In that moment a decade ago, people in their shared grief had been able to recognize each other. Their dual devastation had erased the many barriers life had put between them. In Omaha, the story of James Scurlock would not be one of those stories. Almost instantly, false or unproven information about the deadly encounter spread online. People posted that Gardner had targeted Scurlock and shot him twice from behind. Gardner and his father had used racial slurs, people said. Then, the two men were turned into ugly caricatures. A handful of old Yelp reviews alleging Gardner's bar had a racist door policy were dug up. He was a Trump supporter and thus a fascist. Scurlock was initially lionized online. He'd gone to protest white violence and paid with his life, people wrote. But then video emerged of him vandalizing the business down the block from Gardner's bar, and his prior criminal record surfaced online, and far-right chat rooms lampooned Scurlock as a thug who got what he deserved. Vigilantism gained a menacing momentum as Gardner's telephone number and address were posted on the internet. If troubling, it felt in 2020 dispiritingly predictable, too. The country's divides, political, racial, cultural, had come to feel not just partisan, but sectarian. We didn't just disagree with each other about an election, a debate, a news story. We demonized those on the other side. So there in Omaha, America was acting true to form, insisting on a culprit in every tragedy, digging for clues and motives and easy answers to try and push an agenda rather than accept facts, even misrepresenting or inventing details in the absence of a clear good versus evil narrative. The vigilantes on social media and the partisans in the culture wars need, even lust for, pure villains. Pressure can consequently be brought to bear to bend justice one way or another. And so the people of Omaha found themselves with a fatal tragedy that quickly turned into something else. Competing campaigns of misinformation, oversimplification, which became mean and in the end dangerous too. It all seemed to leave precious little room to contemplate that what happened in May that night in Omaha was a tragedy without culprits. The investigation of Gardner's killing of Scurlock fell to the White County Attorney Don Klein. Klein was a Democrat with some genuine progressive credentials, and after an investigation, his office concluded that Gardner hadn't gone out looking to shoot Scurlock. Witnesses, including Scurlock's friends, said they did not hear Gardner use racial slurs. Gardner may not have had any idea if Scurlock was white or black. Scurlock's death was crushing, Klein determined, but it wasn't a crime. Scurlock's family was a mixed but distinctive clan, talented, hardworking, wayward, committed, loyal. His older brother had done years in prison. Another brother served in the military and became an accomplished artist. A few siblings were activists in the Revolutionary Action Party in North Omaha. They were torn apart by Scurlock's death. But in the end, Scurlock's father wasn't interested in establishing Mr. Gardner as a racist. He just wanted a better investigation into how his son had died, Witnesses had complained that police officers had been uninterested in hearing their accounts. Hadn't bringing a gun out into the chaotic streets been reckless, maybe criminally so? Scurlock's father made the point that if the races of the two men were reversed, there's no way Scurlock would not have been charged. White people get the benefit of the doubt. Black people don't. That's criminal justice in America, they argued. It was a local lawyer, though, who made what amounted to a citizen's case that helped to shape the inflammatory narrative of Gardner's character and motivations. The lawyer, Ryan Wilkins, a white man born and raised in Omaha, confessed that he had wanted to be better at calling out racism. For weeks that summer, he produced a series of posts on Medium and shared them through his Facebook account, making claims. Gardner's father had been indoctrinated into white supremacy behind bars in Texas for drug running. Gardner himself had a swastika tattoo. White supremacist symbology could be found in Gardner's bar's logo. I looked up prison records, and there was nothing about the older Gardner having spent time locked up in Texas. Jake Gardner's medical records contain no references to a swastika tattoo, and any Defamation League expert on white supremacy debunked the idea that Gardner's bar held secret white supremacist codes. Yet the lawyer's posts went viral. Megan Hunt, a white state senator, lamented that the decision not to charge Gardner would embolden other white supremacists like him. White supremacist groups, including ones Jake Gardner was in communication with, rely on you thinking that none of this is a big deal, so they can organize their support, she wrote on Twitter. It has become common for everyday people to insert themselves into contentious criminal cases and local issues over the last decade or so. There have been many benefits. Videos shot on smartphones by bystanders to police killings have brought some real accountability. But there's also a danger in regular people taking on the role of freelance investigators or self-deputized prosecutors and spreading misinformation in the process. Sometimes these actors, driven by a sense of righteousness or maybe a hunger for a hero's turn, don't have much taste for nuanced tragedy. A few days after the shooting, the white prosecutor gave way to community pressure. A special prosecutor was appointed to re-examine the case. The newly named prosecutor was Fred Franklin, a black former federal prosecutor who had spent his career in Omaha. Months later, a grand jury returned a manslaughter indictment. In the following days, Franklin asserted that Gardner wanted to ambush looters that night. Possibly frustrated that he hadn't been able to shoot anyone coming into his bar, he went after Scurlock. He was the first aggressor in the episode and thus could not claim self-defense. Franklin's theory of the case found support among many in Omaha's black community who felt he'd delivered justice at last. The Gardner family was livid. Klein, the county attorney, said he thought that Franklin had pushed an agenda before the grand jury. Facts be damned. Gardner had fled Omaha just days after he shot Scurlock. He bunked for months with a Marine buddy in Portland, Oregon. On the morning he was to board a flight to surrender in Omaha, he shot himself dead. Blood from the wound to his head, staining his old U.S. Marine Corps sweatshirt. Two sons of Omaha, dead by the same hand before they were 40. Even with Mr. Gardner's death, Omaha did not go quiet. Conspiracy theories were floated that he was still alive and under the protection of white supremacists. A local church denied the Gardner family a funeral for their lost son. The pastor, afraid his church would be burned to the ground. Nebraska Democrats censured Klein for abetting white supremacy, and in response, Klein quit his own party. Tucker Carlson and Ann Coulter suggested that a leftist mob, Biden voters, was to be blamed for Gardner's loss. All suicides are, of course, complex human losses. Research has demonstrated that veterans like Gardner who suffered brain injuries are more likely to die by suicide. He had told his parents he feared he could not survive behind bars and that his legal defense would bankrupt his family. It turned out Gardner had left something for the world before his suicide. It was a quotation. It was a saying from the black boxer Reuben Hurricane Carter, who himself had been wrongly convicted of murder in 1967. To live in a world where truth matters and justice, however late, really happens, that world would be heaven enough for us all. I would wind up spending 2.5 years examining the deaths of Scurlock and Gardner. I'd gone to Omaha because I was drawn to heartbreak, and I found a world of that. And I'd gone wondering about the nature of tragedy in America and found no shortage of the ills that afflict the country. A mistrust in the fairness and integrity of our criminal justice system, the lasting harm shouldered by the men and women who fight our wars, the menace of misinformation, and a consuming and destabilizing anger that could see Jake Gardner call the Black Lives Matter movement a terrorist organization and James Scurlock vandalize the businesses of his hometown. But it might have been the suspicion and fear the people of Omaha felt that registered as most truly tragic. Fear of one another, fear of the truth, of what happened might be more nuanced than they suspected, fear of simply being honest in public. One witness to Scurlock's killing accused me of trying to gaslight him when I wanted simply to double-check his account. Another wouldn't talk to me unless I stipulated Gardner was a racist. Then we could talk. Another would not talk to any white male reporter. Every person I was able to track down who had posted about Gardner being a white supremacist admitted to me they had no evidence of it. Marines who had fought with Gardner didn't want their friendship made public and worried that their families would be harmed. The legal director of the ACLU was let go in part because he told his staff he thought Klein's legal assessment of the case was sound. A close family friend of the Scurlocks said she was fired from her job at a nursing home after other staffers said the memorial pin she wore upset patients. It was a black former Marine who captured that tragedy of Omaha most powerfully. He had served with Gardner, gone to his bar, appeared on a news segment with him to talk about their service. Gardner, he said, had treated him like a brother throughout. The black man in me wonders what the hell Jake was doing with a gun out there that night, he told me. But the Marine in me is open to the idea I might have done the same thing Jake did in firing that gun. It felt complicated, but candid, conflicted, but genuine. It felt empathetic and true. Yet the Marine told me he would not be named. He said he might lose his job if he were. He told me he was sorry, but felt he was without a choice. With a sadness hard to measure, I said I understood. Thank you. If anybody wants a really good weight reduction program, have open heart surgery. Yeah. You drop tons of pounds. You look great. I mean, it's expensive. I get it, but. I think you have to turn the mic on.
Oh, is it me? Oh, there we go. I was just about to ask, can you hear me? Can you hear me now? Okay, great, thank you. Thanks so much for having us. Really glad to be here, and not boring as that was. Just really glad to be here with you, Joe. I'm struck by the dogged following of threads in the search for truth, however complicated or simple it might be, and just the grace in which you pursued that in writing this book. I'm just continually impressed by it. Because of course there's all kinds of resonance for all of us in the entire walk that we're in right now. But I think, just think there's a lot of courage in going and flying into the maelstrom like that. One thing that I'm curious about, I mean, obviously you were led to this by a kind of assignment, but as you pursued it, as you dove in and swam in it, what drew you in to the heart of it?
Well, once the, the crisis of, next week's publishing hole, came and went, I decided, well, I'm at least going to follow what goes on, right? And so I would follow news accounts out of Omaha. And when Fred Franklin, the black former federal prosecutor, was named as a special prosecutor, I was like, oh, that doesn't happen every day. And recognizing that his race could either be a great benefit to a new investigation or the source of, some future upset. But, it was the summer of COVID, and so the grand jury process took a long time. I think they met over 3 months. And then in September, if I knew how to set up a Google alert, I would have, but I don't. But, I found there was a news account came across about Gardner's suicide. Mm-hmm. And, I've been in the newspaper business for 4 decades now. And I knew as soon as I read that headline that it was highly unusual, really heartbreaking, and that I was determined to try and figure out what the hell really had happened and who the hell were these 2 young men. That's just wild. But I wanted to ask you, as it unfolded, as you investigated all this, did you find yourself flip-flopping back and forth about what you thought happened, based on what you were seeing, but based on your own intuition? Or? Well, in the interest of complete candor, and maybe John was hinting at this in his
I was like, careful now, people.
Rather strange tribute to me as not necessarily such a bad guy. But I am, and people know this to be true, I am a contrarian. And I have to confess that what really animated me at the start was I thought that Gardner had gotten railroaded, and I perhaps too enthusiastically wanted to go do a provocative story about how a white guy got a raw deal. And Todd can attest to this. I think, when I wrote the magazine version of it, which was not a short piece, I'm mortified today that if that had ever been published, I would be deeply embarrassed. Because given the opportunity and freedom and time to actually research it as a book, I think I myself had reduced James Scurlock to a bit of a caricature in the magazine piece. There had been references to his prior criminal record. And there were two things, or several things, that he was supposedly guilty of burglary as a kid. He had supposedly served as a lookout in an armed home invasion in the town of Norfolk, Nebraska. And he had beaten the woman who was the mother of his first and only child.
These were all alleged or proven, or?
No, they're all true, but or at least that was how it existed in the. And I was able to look up enough of his criminal background to understand that was largely true. Mm-hmm. But when I went out to do the book, and I actually got off my ass and did some real reporting, I got hold of his real full criminal case history. And it turns out that his first arrest for burglary, he was 11. He was a homeless child in Norfolk. He was living with his family in a shelter, and he had gone into a neighbor's house and taken a PlayStation game. An 11-year-old homeless boy stealing a toy. That got my attention.
And deemed burglary.
Yes. And he's actually charged and put on probation as an 11-year-old. 5 years later, he's 16, and his older brother, JT, who had his own kind of troubled background, enlists him to be part of this, what had existed in the news coverage as a armed home invasion. And look, I don't want to minimize the crime, but in Norfolk, they went to a house of some other young people that was a drug house, and they were going to steal the drug money.
Right.
It was as knuckle-headed an operation as you could imagine. JT, his brother, who was the ringleader, when they go into the home, he has a mask on, but it falls off. The woman that they're, about to steal from, he turns out they had worked together at McDonald's. She immediately recognized him.
Right.
James actually went into the wrong house when they set out and failed to bring the backpack, which is what they were going to take all of their proceeds home in. I think the caper netted them, I believe, $12 and half an ounce of pot. But when he's charged with now the violent crime, and when he goes before a judge, there's a question of whether he's going to be tried as a juvenile or as an adult. And if he's tried as a juvenile, he'd have the chance at probation and maybe some actual services. And the judge decides, well, he needs to be tried as an adult because he has a prior. And his prior was the 11-year-old boy taking a toy out of a neighbor's house. Mm. So he's sent away for 3 to 5 years.
And that's a significant stain on anyone's record just talking about that, and reminds me of, there's a show that I narrate, some of you may know of it, it's called The First 48. It follows the first 48 hours of various homicide investigations, but these are the real cases. I remember in one episode, one of the cops, he looks like he might be in his late 30s, early 40s. He's white. He talks about having grown up differently than he appears to be now, a little rough and tumble, and with kids very much like kids he was pursuing in this particular case. But he made the point that he had the opportunity to grow up a little bit. He had the opportunity to grow up a little bit and get beyond the various things that he that were illegal, very similar to this, that would put him in the same situation if people knew about it. And he just was making the point that not everyone, our society does not look blindly on everyone. Justice is not blind in that way all the time. So,
Yeah, I mean, and again, not in any false modesty or whatever, but you mentioned, the doggedness in pursuing, the threads of the story. The truth is, the reporting was not that hard. And one of the sadnesses of it is that, it's another example of the cost of the sort of, evisceration of news organizations in smaller towns like Omaha. The Omaha World Herald was once upon a time a really formidable paper and capable of doing, really enterprising and consequential work. This was a story for a while in Omaha, and they would follow it. But, to this day, no newspaper in Omaha has actually ever even written a profile of either of the two men.
is that right?
Yeah.
Wow, that's amazing.
And so on the other side, on the Gardner side, with a little bit of work, and again, I'm not being modest. It was just basic, reporting, whatever. Found out that, so he had been with one of the first Marine units into
Iraq.
In 2003. They fought at the Battle of Nasiriyah, which it was really arresting for me to go back. You think you remember the Iraq War and the ugly Fallujah and various ugly spots in it. Nasiriyah was a terrible fiasco for the Americans. I think they lost 38 soldiers in a day. That was where Jessica Lynch was taken or supposedly taken, and that became its own crazy military scandal. And Gardner had been there, and there was a 28-hour firefight. And anyway, he and his unit are awarded a presidential medal at the end of their service. But Gardner goes on another tour to Haiti in a peacekeeping mission in 2004. And when he gets back from Haiti, he's nearing the end of his term. He's going to be discharged. And he goes out to a bar just off of Camp Lejeune and gets into some kind of scuffle with the bouncer or whatever. Anyway, outside the bar, he's taken to the ground and curb stomped. Loses 12 teeth, has his jaw broken in 2 places, whatever. So when I found out that, then you're like, okay, maybe when he's actually on the ground in front of his own bar that night in Omaha, he knows full well at what risk he is. And whether it's PTSD or simple, survival things kicking in, it makes his behavior, if not pardonable or forgivable or, or legally different, it certainly informs what might have been going on in his head.
Sure.
And it had never been reported in Omaha.
That's unbelievable, actually. Obviously just what you uncovered and just what the story is a much more nuanced real life tale than the way it was presented before. And it defies easy digestion, you can say, but I think, it's an important story for us to grapple with, for us to take into and to think about. I'm also curious, I was really curious about your experience with these families, because I know it was difficult for both of them. Two people who should not be dead are, and their loved ones, and I'm sure there's a lot of anguish. But can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, and I will say this, that, I'll be honored if people here bought the book, and both surprised and delighted if they find a time to read it.
It won't be too boring.
I don't know, and it may be a good book, it may be a mediocre book. I don't know. The one thing I am
It's a great book.
one thing I'm absolutely proud of is that over 3 years now, I was the link between these two families. They had no reason to trust me, either of them, and they had every reason to be angry, suspicious, enraged, toward each other. They each knew that I was deeply engaged with the other family, and I'm pretty proud of the fact I held that set of relationships together to this day. I'll do this quickly just for the laugh. But I had gone out to do a book event in Omaha in May, and the members of the two families had committed to coming, and I thought that was pretty remarkable. And I went for a run, had a little chest pain, finished my run, of course. Went for a run the next day and had to stop after a mile. And I was like, well, I called my wife, I called my primary care doc. They said, you should go to the ER. It took me a little while, but I did, and I had a Big Mac on the way. Because I figured if I had a heart attack, it's already, damage is already done. But I got to the hospital, and they did some blood work, and they said, well, you have elevated levels of troponin, and this is suggestive of a small heart attack. If the next round of blood work comes back positive as well, we'll schedule you for a catheterization, and it'll go up and take a look at your heart. And it came back positive, and they said, well, we're going to do it tomorrow. And I was like, great. But I have a book event tonight. Would you ever agree to discharge me if I promise to come right back? So I went to the book event with my hospital bracelet on, and both family members did turn up. And each of them came up to me, and they're like, what's with the hospital bracelet? And I said, they just said it was a small heart attack. And they were like, you are completely nuts. But that they both showed up. They were in the same room. The father of James, the aunt of Jake Gardner. And I believe, there were times across the couple of years where I was curious and would have facilitated them meeting. But across all of that, those years, neither family ever pumped me for information about the other. They were not paranoid that I was talking to the other. And when I started to share some of what I was finding with them, like when I told the Gardner family what James Scurlock's true criminal record was, they were shocked because they had this understanding that it was much more, violent and awful, and I think they were, it really registered with them. And when I told the Scurlock family about Gardner's, brutal beating outside a bar in Camp Lejeune, it was news to them, and I think it registered with them. It didn't resolve everything, but I have great affection for both families. I'm in touch with them all the time. I'm headed back to Omaha in a couple weeks.
Oh, great.
The University of Nebraska is going to host a symposium on the book.
Wow.
And I hope to see them again. They're human beings, in every great and flawed way.
We're not. We're not trying to be voyeurs. I'm not trying to be a voyeur, but how was it for the relatives when you were in the room together with them when you were there? For the aunt and for the.
Oh, I think they were cognizant that the other family members were there, but they didn't.
They didn't interact,
They
okay.
didn't meet, and but neither of them were, upset either.
Yeah. By the way, Joe sent me this photo, a couple months ago, with his shirt pulled up and gnarly scar down his chest. And Joe and I didn't know each other before working on this. Michael and I did, but before working on this. But obviously I was like, I guess I got a friend for life out of this. But he sent me this thing, pulled up, and it seemed completely in character to me. And I thought, level 33 in our friendship, great. I thought nothing else about it. I was like, good information. He had open heart surgery sometime in the past. I had no idea until a couple of weeks ago that since we saw each other last, this has happened, and I was dumbstruck. I was dumbstruck. So I'm just glad that I'm glad you're doing okay.
I'd like to turn the tables here a second and ask you a question or two.
Yes, sir.
Because I am, the world of audio books is such a big deal these days, and you're obviously great at it. I'd be curious to hear about your process, how you pick them, how you kind of engage with them. I'm genuinely curious.
Well, a little bit about me. I'm a lifelong lover of books from being, this is my son over here. It's okay, Obes. That's Obi. Hi, Obi. Since Obi's age, all the first travels that I did were through books, and so lifelong lover of books. It's easy for me to love reading. And I'm an actor, as you know. I've had a really beautiful journey, really rewarding career and experience. So some years ago, I was doing a show, world premiere of a new play, Lost Tennessee Williams play in London, and I met a guy who was a friend of a guy in the show who narrated audiobooks, both in London and New York, because he lives in both places. And I said, that sounds like fun. Maybe when I get back, you can make an introduction. And he did, but I had no idea that I would fall in love with this aspect of my work as much as I have, and that there would be so much love and respect for it. But for me, it's a little bit like Pooh Fell in the Honey Pot, because, books, acting, mashed up, it's like Reese's, two great tastes, But it's, I get offered a lot of great things. I'm really blessed and fortunate to be able to say that, which is great. So I don't have to turn down many things, but that's that. In terms of process, first of all, I read the book. I just try to read it like a reader, like any of us might read it, just be open to what's going on. I mean, if I know that I'm going to be narrating it, or if I know that I'm considering it, there's maybe some consideration, something comes up and that may pop out about a question, I wonder how that would go, or how, but usually I'm trying to fall into the story, just like everybody else. But I try to be sensitive to what I think the author is trying to say, and also what the journey of these people are in the book. And I don't plan much out. I almost plan nothing out, to tell you the truth. My way that I approach them is I read it, find out anything that I feel like I need to know that I don't know in it, and then I like to run off the cliff, and we'll see how this story wants to be told. With your beautiful piece of work, challenging piece of work. I just had an experience. You took me through a whole experience of like pinballing back and forth between how everybody was feeling, what was going on, and what was the truth. And one thing that just jumped out to me a lot, and I hope it's reflected in the narration of the book, is that these things seemed clear, and then they weren't so clear. And then this seemed clear, and then it wasn't so clear. And even though the easy route would have been to sort of amplify or side with what was popular or less difficult or what many people thought, you didn't just do that. And that made for a compelling and not easy experience in terms of grappling with the book. Because, listen, we all live here in New York. And we wouldn't have to go very far to find any number of instances in our town, and just in our town, maybe even our neighborhoods, that that are complicated, nuanced, that beg out for a wider, deeper view of humans than oftentimes we're willing to give. And in fact, I heard somebody I was overhearing somebody the other day say something to the effect of like, yeah, well, you can't open your heart to everybody like that. You just can't. You have to make a decision. What do you see? And it's understandable how humans do that. But your book and what I think the things you're grappling with, Joe, just really put the challenge about why we actually mustn't do that, or we must resist. We must resist that so that we can actually see each other, hear each other, even when we disagree, or even when we find out, so that we can maybe find out, is there a higher right or wrong? Is there a right or wrong here? Or just be able to see each other. So anyway, that's not on audiobooks, but.
Well, why don't you give us a flavor of that Hall of Fame
Oh, God, okay.
voice? You want to take a shot?
Yeah, sure. What Joe was referring to earlier, I was saying, I'm going to try to keep these readings short because, I like to leave people in a little bit more rather than boring them to death, like Joe tried to do with you guys earlier. But no, he did not. He did not. These two sections, they're basically from both parts of the story. I don't even want to characterize it like that.
I can set you up.
Go ahead, please.
The first one is 188.
Yep.
And it starts.
I'm there.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the, once I had started to kind of research the book more formally and had figured out how to actually navigate our smart TV up in Vermont, I somehow came across a documentary called Out of Omaha, which had been made in 2019. And so I sat down and watched it one night, and I'm like, well, I think it'll become evident. Go ahead.
Okay. Excuse me. The story of young James Scurlock could not be reported without a fuller appreciation of North Omaha, the place of his birth and where he lived when he was killed. I bought books and watched documentaries. I drove its streets, learned of the museum dedicated to the ugly history of redlining in North Omaha. I attended its Native Omaha Days parade, an event held every 2 years that brings North Omaha's former black residents back to their roots. Churches were well represented. Mount Moriah, Zion Baptist, the Revolutionary Action Party had a float. There were women on motorcycles and elderly men in Shriner hats driving tiny motor cars. There was a Save the Youth marching team and the Primetime Steppers. Look presentable, the woman leading the Steppers told them. Who knows how many cameras are out there? You look lazy. I'm going to pull you out of line. 4 generations of a single family could be seen lining one block of the parade. Over my weeks and months in Omaha, I met with North Omaha legislators and activists, young and old. Some had lived the glory days of North Omaha, when it was a neighborhood of Black accomplishment and enterprise, electric with music clubs and gospel choirs of its many churches. Others had worked to recover that glory after the damaging unrest of the 1960s and the decades and years of governmental neglect since. One was Preston Love Jr., whose legendary father had played with Count Basie and Duke Ellington. Love had worked in senior roles on both Jesse Jackson's unsuccessful presidential bid and the successful campaign of Harold Washington to become Chicago's first Black mayor. I was happy in segregated North Omaha, Love told me of his childhood. We felt the trauma of racism, but we felt it together. But Love, still in North Omaha, said he today was saddened by the fate of his community. It had suffered both the further betrayal of Omaha's white establishment and the surrender of its own people to political apathy. The number of people who voted in North Omaha was embarrassing. I'm shocked and dismayed, he said, at the state of my beloved North Omaha. I met with Brenda Council, too, the first Black female city council member and a two-time candidate for mayor of Omaha, and Ben Gray, who did years of gang intervention work before being elected to the city council as well. Council said she'd gone to a school with no gym, no cafeteria, and not a single white resident. The shared bond with North Omaha, though, was strong enough to ward off any sense of inferiority or grievance. We didn't know how poor we were, she said. Among the more fascinating characters I met in my makeshift research was Adam Fletcher Sase, a white man who easily convinced me through his published work and excited phone calls that he was the unparalleled expert on North Omaha. Sase had lived homeless in Canada in his early years and wound up in Omaha at age 10 after his family car broke down 3 times on the city's outskirts as they tried to make their way to Kansas City. He grew up among the poor whites who lived in the trailer park north of Dodge Street, but he became charmed and then consumed by researching the history of North Omaha. Those efforts now run to more than 500 articles online, many of them collected in 4 volumes he self-published. Detailed and sweeping, his work gets at it all, from the neighborhood's fur trading days, to its polyglot collection of ethnic neighborhoods, to the impact of the Trans-Mississippi Exposition. He has captured North Omaha's economic trajectory, and he's created elaborate timelines of its racial history, including, by his count, 100 riots. He writes candidly of the crack wars and, with much alarm, the Black exodus from the city quietly taking place in recent years, down from 20% of Omaha's population to 12%. North Omaha is a kind of invigorating, illuminating obsession he, with a smile, still can't fully make sense of. But his scholarship and crusading have a clear and convincing declaration. You underappreciate North Omaha at your own peril. It is not, he argues, what many of the white people in Omaha have often reduced it to, an irredeemable ghetto. It is in one of our conversations, I asked him about a documentary I had seen called Out of Omaha. Sase worried the film, however well-intentioned, risked reinforcing the hopelessness that can dominate discussions of North Omaha today. But he acknowledged its power and did not question whether it had an appropriateness for anyone trying to understand James Scurlock's world. The 2018 film, directed by Clay Tweed, is a 90-minute feature that traces the tale of the twin Trotter brothers, Darcel and Darnell, as they do daily struggle against what one character, Wayne Brown, called North Omaha's gravitational pull. Brown had grown up in North Omaha, but gone on to become a successful lawyer. He said North Omaha's pull of affection and danger, of family and history, of hard racial realities and easy street money, can be so great that it makes it near impossible to fly out of. Of life in North Omaha, one of the twins, Darcel, says, "I'm dying the same time I'm living." The documentary unfolds over 7 years, from 2010 to 2017, and it, like all stories about today's North Omaha, tries to capture the systemic challenges of the neighborhood without reducing it to a place of fatal pathologies. The father of the boys is an addict and drug merchant, but he also takes both of them in when they manage the modest flight out of North Omaha to Grand Island, Nebraska. Grand Island, Nebraska, a rural, virtually all-white town where they find work and ultimately a future. When Darcel is implicated in a violent break-in and decides to turn himself in to the authorities, his father gets to him before he heads to jail. "He showed me the ropes, how to survive inside," Darcel says with gratitude. It's not perhaps an ideal episode of fatherly advice, but it is a conscious act born of care and loyalty all the same. Segment by segment, I watched the film and could feel the echoes of it in all the stories of James Scurlock. The broken up parents, the dad capable of love and disappointment, a victim of his own demons, the experience outside Omaha and how trouble could find one there too. But the sense of community and durability as well. How music was both a soundtrack to daily life and a career goal that might launch them from North Omaha's loving but sometimes lethal grip. And how children searching for identity and joy can find it in having children, perhaps too early. Guns are a fact of life in North Omaha, and a character in the film. Picking up a gun, Wayne Brown says, is expected by the community, by family, by police. But Darcel makes clear having one is as often an act of self-defense, as often as not, an act of self-defense, not criminal intent. Brown grew up in North Omaha, the son of a man, he says, in the heroin business. He got out, got a law degree, married a doctor, and returned. He made it out long enough then to become a supposed example of what the Academy likes to call black exceptionalism. A kid who faced down danger, refused to be defeated, made something extraordinary of himself against all odds. He's not having it. He did the thug thing, the dope dealing and gun carrying and gang activity. To the extent he became exceptional is as much as anything else a matter of luck. "I didn't get caught," he says. The webs of young black men in North Omaha or Grand Island are many, traps of their own making and those spun by the cynical systems of failed schools and predatory police. There's so much to read here. I'm going to pause.
That's it.
I'm going to pause because it's a lot. You guys can read it all, but it's a lot.
And I'm just
And also, let me.
You're going to read another bit. If we were in the theater, there might have been an intermission by now. We're not, but I want to just be mindful that there's still some folks who might want to ask a question
absolutely.
or two. So I want you to do what you were intending to do, but I'm just sort of
No, it's good.
giving you a little heads
Actually,
up.
it's good. Also, forgive me. There's a glare from where I sit, so I can't quite, these not 24 eyes can't quite pick it up as well as easily. But so the other section I was going to read was one that spoke from the Garner family experience and from Jake, and giving you a little dimension to his background, where he came from, and the forces that made him who he was.
Well, yeah, so I'm watching that documentary, and I'm like, well, this is James Scurlock's life, and it kind of, hits you in a number of ways. One, this might be useful for the book, but two, right? This is 2019. I'm doing my book in 2020. There's going to be a James Scurlock in 2023 as well, so it was a great gift to me to have come across it. And similarly, on the Gardner side, an extraordinary bit of luck is, so at the Battle of Nasiriyah, I wanted to understand that, and I bought a military history of the battle, and then I got turned on to the fact that somebody who had served with Gardner in that unit had actually come out of the service and written a one-act play called The Sandstorm about that one night of the 28-hour firefight. And and it's a beautifully done little play. Sean Hughes is the Marine who did it. And again, was a great gift to me. So I found a documentary, for James, and I found, a one-act play that, since Jake's dead, and I talked to other Marines who were there, but I was given this, quite vivid, powerful, poignant, and upsetting appreciation of the damage done to the U.S. Marines, not only the ones who were killed, but those who survived and came home.
Wow, it's a lot. I mean, well, before we open it up a little bit, I just want to say one more time, I'm just, I'm really grateful, for Joe, for the journey you took in writing this book and following the threads and approaching it all with enough grace between all of the families and players, and in distilling this enough for us. I don't mean chewing it up for us so that we don't have to digest anything, but distilling it enough for us that you can prick us to think about this incident that happened, and all the other things that we're walking through a little bit differently. Thanks, man.
Thank you. Well, and how lucky did I get, right? Because every time I call Dion up or whatever, he's like, "Oh, I'm narrating the MLK biography or whatever," and then last week he's like, "Oh yeah, no, I'm doing Sly Stone's book." I'm like, "Dude, how about me, man?"
I did it already, man. It's much better than my reading tonight, but I did it already.
Yeah, okay, you tell me whose life's more interesting, me or Sly Stone.
Should we take a
Yes.
few questions?
Yes.
So before I open this up, I want to mention that there are books for sale. If you want to buy a book and want Joe to sign it, we'll be holding that little opportunity right here, right after the Q&A and the sign-off. So keep that in mind as you think about how many questions you have. I have a question. What do you have against numbering chapters? Raise your hand if you have a better question, but I do. That was a genuine question.
Contrarian.
What's that? Contrarian.
Well, I mean, I can't tell you how poorly equipped I was to try and write a book, because I had never attempted it. I stopped reading them about 30 years ago. So I was like, I don't know how to organize a book. So I really just relied on a gimmick I've taken to using in just journalistic stories or whatever, which is to not have a formal, chapter one, but have some little, quotation from a character who appears in the following chapter. I was fully expecting people to, when I sent it in, well, here's one thing, second thing I'm proud of is, so I never wanted to write a book, I was scared to do it, whatever, and then they tell you, well, you have 100,000 words. And we've all spent our lives as newspaper people, begging for can I get another 100 words? And there's no way I can write this story without it being 2,000 words. And then somebody tells you, well, you can have 100,000. And you're like, how the hell am I ever going to write 100,000 words?
Here comes another question.
Hi. I guess my question is, why not write a simpler story? The country's so divided as it is. Why not? There are so many unfortunate murders, and why not tell one that might be easier for us to digest?
Well, because that would be cowardly, I would think. The Can you hear me?
Try it again.
All right, we're good.
Yep.
Oh, so cause I guess my answer was because that would be cowardly. No, I mean, I dedicate the book to my wife, Beth, and my 4 daughters, Jane, Lucy, Flynn, and Rowan. And in the dedication, I said, a story told straight. And that feels vanishingly rare today, to have a story told straight. And I think that always, in some ways to me, was the adequate rationale for writing it at all. You can tell a complicated story straight, and I hope I did. But I don't have any interest in writing simple stories.
Here's the next question.
Hi, Joe. Clearly, your relationship with both families was so important to you and to the book. I wonder if you could tell us quick, like, how you got that first key, crucial meeting these folks for the first time. How did you, win them over in that first moment?
Well, it didn't take much, to be honest. I think, these two families had watched their 2 sons, right, be turned into cartoon characters, whatever, right? And I think for all the pain they felt of having lost their boys, they wanted their story of who their boys were told. So it really didn't take a lot of convincing. I think they were, they wanted to do it deeply and badly. The delicate part is, and if you don't know, Michael Wilson is one of the great reporters and writers at the New York Times, and for many years wrote a great column, I think, conceived by another great New York Times reporter and editor, Wendell Jameson, called Crime Scene. So Mike's got his history writing about crime stories. And now I've completely lost my train of thought as what was I saying? No, but, so right, it's stepping into fresh grief, right? And even though they wanted to participate and they wanted their stories told, they were in pieces as human beings and as a family. And, you had to let them be for long periods of time. And then we could return to it. But
We've got another working mic, so.
Okay, does everyone hear me? After 100,000 words and all the interviews and all the time, do you feel like you know all the answers and that you know who's right and who's wrong, or do you still feel in this story there's stuff that's sort of unknowable that you'll never fully be able to understand?
To this day, I wake up at night in a cold sweat about the possibility that Jake Gardner indeed was a white supremacist, and I just didn't find it out. Or that, James Scurlock was, a far more violent and brutal individual than I'd been able to uncover. I literally wake up at 5 a.m. almost every day worried about that.
So, Joe, I want to hear more about what happened after you said, oh my God, what am I going to do with the 100,000 words? Because, like the last 3 people, I'm also one of the veterans of the Joe Sexton editing process, so I knew you were going to say that about the pearls, that each one sets up the chapter, these little quotes. But beyond that, I'm hoping there was, please tell me there was, like, was there a time when you were doing this, when you had embarked upon organizing this book, and you started to feel like, now I know how to do this, this is working, and what was it that, like, was there, other than just using the Pearls method on like 100,000 words, was there some other moment that cracked open the process for you and made you confident that you could go and do the whole
Well,
thing? And how did it feel?
Well, I'll tell you what the process was, and Beth can attest to it, or whatever. So I was, scared as hell about how am I ever going to write 100,000 words. And so I decided to get up every morning at 5 a.m. And write 1,000 words every day. And it doesn't sound like the most inspired and creative way to approach it, but it really helped ease my anxiety about, could I actually get to this number? And, as Ann knows, and many people here, right, we can write 1,000-word stories, all the time. We've been doing it all our lives. And so I wrote 1,000 words every day for, 2 months, and I was at 60,000 words. And I was like, I might make it. And I will tell you this, and again, it's kind of sick and maybe at my own risk, whatever. I turned in 117,000 words 4 months early.
Wow.
Now, I'm not sure that that's a good thing.
Not 200,000.
So, Joe, I was wondering if you've heard from the county attorney, Mr. Klein, since you published, in the sense that what went through my mind as I read was, I think the homicide detective said it, Hennihan, maybe it deserved a more scrutiny initially, and that would have served everyone better.
Yeah, I mean, so, one of the things, and I always want to be careful about the language that I use because, it can be a little odd to be sort of talking about book process and writing, and when I most want to always respect, like, these two families and not make it seem like it's a, it's a gimmick or a hustle to sell books or whatever. But one of the appeals of it for storytelling purposes is you have these, right? You have a white young man, you have a black young man, both of whom die before they're 40. You have a white county attorney and a black special prosecutor. And so there were these parallel characters, and I got to talk to both of them. It was the black prosecutor who ultimately shut me out. The white county attorney, I think, again, also, he had been pilloried. He'd been run out of his own party. He'd had his political career put at risk because he had supposedly abetted white supremacy. So I think he was eager to tell his story as well. And he's a very stand-up guy. And like I said, they all sort of failed to meet right? You would have, somebody told you the bare facts of this story, you probably would have guessed the white county attorney was a hard-ass Republican, hard-right, law and order county attorney who let the white guy go. But he's a Democrat. He's created all sorts of interesting and novel courts in Omaha, including a court for damaged veterans. So he was a straight-up guy. He said everything on the record. He made his staff available to me as well. I was quite impressed by him. And for Fred Franklin, I had 2 extraordinary interviews with him, and I was dumbstruck that he would have ever consented to it. And he did, and he was forthcoming and an answer. And then he just, once he thought he could detect that I had a kind of critical point of view, he shut me down.
So I saw your interview, maybe it's on your website, with Nicole Wallace, and you were extraordinarily animated by this story and by sharing the opportunity to share it. And all these months later, it's so alive in you. It's kind of incredible. I'm impressed with your stamina. I think it has something to do with your heart surgery, but maybe not. But I'm going to suggest that we call it a night and let the conversation continue with you. You guys should definitely take the show on the road. So we hope to see more of you. I think I speak for us all in saying I hope you write some more books. And thank you for this. Thank you both. Please give it up for these guys. And buy a book and get it signed. Thanks for being here.
And we're going to sign books in the back?
You want to do it back there? I was going to do it here, but no, you know what? They're back there, right? Yeah, we'll do it back there. Okay, peace.